In addition to locomotives, railroads also need train cars to carry both freight and passengers in order to do what they do. And in the 20th century, some of the most famous passenger trains in the United States, at least, would all have one thing in common: a company whose name would become synonymous with luxury rail travel. This is the story of the Pullman Car Company. The story of the Pullman Car Company begins sometime in the mid-1800s when a man named George Pullman had to spend the night on a train from Buffalo to Westfield, New York. Pullman spent the uncomfortable night sleeping in his seat due to lack of proper sleeping accommodations. This horrible experience would inspire Pullman to design a brand new railroad sleeping car. The car would have seating for passengers during the day and compartments in the roof that would fold down into beds for passengers to sleep on during the nights. Though not quite a sleeping car in the modern sense, it was still a drastic improvement over what they had before. Pullman's first car would be built by the Chicago and Alton Railroad's Bloomington, Illinois shops in 1859. Following its success, Pullman would establish his own company in 1860. In addition to providing proper beds, Pullman's cars also featured carpeted floors and cushioned seating. Some even provided small libraries so passengers could read books during their trip if they so desired. Additionally, in 1867, Pullman would begin using special wheels on their sleepers that were made of paper. Wait, what? Okay, I know that sounds crazy, but to clarify, the wheels had a paper core that was about 200 sheets thick, bonded together with flour-based glue. Once the glue cured, the wheels would be bolted to a cast iron hub and a steel outer rim. The purpose of this was to reduce noise and vibration, providing a smoother and quieter ride. And as crazy as it may sound, this setup did work. Until it didn't. You see, the problem with paper train wheels was that they tended to fail suddenly without showing obvious signs of deterioration. And after this resulted in multiple derailments, paper train wheels were outlawed in the United States by 1915. Anyway, in April of 1880, Pullman announced his plans to create a new factory and company town located 14 miles south of Chicago. The town was called Pullman, Illinois, and by January of 1881, the first residents began moving in. The homes in Pullman, Illinois featured some of the most modern luxuries that the 1880s had to offer, such as indoor plumbing and gas heat. However, in spite of this, Pullman was far from perfect. You see, town officials in Pullman, Illinois were not elected, but appointed by none other than George Pullman himself. Workers also had to rent their homes from the Pullman Company. All of these issues would eventually come to a head in 1894 in what we know today as the Pullman Strike. Now, the Pullman Strike could almost be its own video, but here's a brief summary of what happened. After the Panic of 1893 threw the United States into the worst economic recession it would see prior to the Great Depression, many railroads stopped purchasing new passenger cars, and Pullman's sales began to plummet as a result. So to compensate, George Pullman cut worker wages by up to 30%. However, rental prices and utility rates in the company town, which remember Pullman owned, remained the same. And any employees who tried to complain about it were fired. This led many Pullman employees to join the American Railway Union, or ARU, under the leadership of Eugene Debs. And in 1894, the Pullman workers walked out on the job and initiated the strike. The American Railway Union also organized a boycott of all trains that ran Pullman cars. The strike escalated to the point where President Grover Cleveland decided to send the U.S. Army to deal with the striking workers. In the end, the Pullman strike was unsuccessful, coming to an end on July 20th, 1894. In the aftermath of the strike, the American Railway Union was dissolved, and Union leader Eugene Debs was sentenced to 6 months in prison for conspiracy to obstruct the mail. Some good did come out of the strike, however, as later the same year, President Grover Cleveland designated Labor Day as a national holiday in an attempt to conciliate the labor unions. George Pullman himself would pass away on October 19th of 1897. And the company would be taken over by Robert Todd Lincoln, who, side note, was the son of President Abraham Lincoln. The Pullman Company continued to face scrutiny for several years after the Pullman Strike. In 1894, the Illinois State Supreme Court required the Pullman Company to sell off the company town, as building it in the first place was a violation of their corporate charter. And to this day, Pullman, Illinois remains a part of Chicago. The Pullman Company didn't just build the cars, they also operated the services on board them. The Pullman Company began hiring their own porters in 1868. Given that this was post-Civil War America, many Pullman porters were newly freed African Americans. For many, it was the first paid work they ever had. However, it is important to note that the Pullman Company mostly hired them because they knew they could get away with paying them less, because that was legal back then. Pullman porters also frequently suffered verbal and even physical abuse from both passengers and their employer. After decades of this abuse, the Pullman porters began to unionize in 1925, forming the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, under the leadership of one A. Philip Randolph. The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters would reach an agreement with the Pullman Company by 1937 to increase worker wages. However, in 1944, the United States Department of Justice required Pullman to divest from either their operations or their manufacturing divisions. This was due to an antitrust complaint which had been filed in 1940. And the operations division was sold to their respective railroads. As for the manufacturing division, going into the 20th century, Pullman began making their cars out of steel instead of wood. In 1930, they would merge with Standard Steel Car to become Pullman Standard. However, around this time, Pullman began seeing stiff competition from the Budd Company. The Budd Company got their start building auto body components out of steel. They're actually credited with the first all-steel automotive body, which they built for Dodge. Budd's first entry into the rail market came in 1931, in the form of a lightweight, streamlined rail car called the Silver Slipper. Though it was largely considered a failure, the Silver Slipper did show the potential of lightweight streamliner sets. Pullman Standard would get their foot into the streamliner door in 1934 when they built the all-aluminum car body for the Union Pacific M10000. Pullman would continue producing their own lightweight streamlined passenger cars. In many cases, they even copied the Budd Company's fluted steel exteriors. In 1934, they also began producing a line of standardized freight cars. However, the passenger cars were still what they were really known for. And in the years following the Second World War, many railroads would deliberately advertise the fact that their passenger cars were built by Pullman Standard. And their cars could be found on the most iconic trains of the 20th century, including the Santa Fe Super Chief, the New York Central 20th Century Limited, and the Great Northern Empire Builder. To go over everything that Pullman was responsible for would literally take all day. However, going into the 1960s, it would become clear that Pullman's success wouldn't last. In 1956, President Dwight D. Eisenhower created the U.S. Interstate Highway System, and many Americans chose to drive places rather than taking trains. Commercial air travel also began to become much more affordable. Many railroads began to struggle as a result, specifically in their passenger departments because people simply weren't using them anymore. Sales at Pullman Standard naturally suffered as a result. They would build their last sleeper car in 1956, and in 1965 they would build their last lightweight passenger cars in an order for Kansas City Southern. Pullman Standard would continue producing train cars for subways and intercity commuter services. However, in the 1970s, they began selling off assets and slowly dissolving the company. And the last train cars they ever produced would be the Superliner 1s that they built for Amtrak in 1978. Pullman's passenger car designs would be spun off under the name Pullman Technologies Incorporated, which would be purchased by Bombardier Transportation. And Bombardier themselves would be purchased by Alstom in 2021. And both companies have had a very questionable track record in recent years, but we'll save that for another video. The freight car division was sold to Trinity Industries, who still manufactures railroad cars to this day. Many Pullman rail cars are preserved in museums all throughout the United States, and even in other countries for that matter. Though Pullman may no longer be around, and they've done some questionable things in their early history, I would argue they've had a massive impact on the history of America as a whole, but especially the railroads. And with that, as always, thank you all for watching. I'm Tim the Train Guy, and bye for now.